what's going on, everybody, and welcome back to my channel, Movie Files. Elliot back again with a brand new Netflix movie review, and today we are discussing part 3 of the Fear Street trilogy. We're talking part 3, 1666. Now, I am going to obviously talk about my thoughts of this film, but I also want to have the conversation about the trilogy as a whole, the experience, what was my favorite part, what was my favorite character, but then I also want to have a discussion with you all in regards to this strategy of releasing a film a week, and if we would like to see that be applied to TV shows a la Stranger Things. We're going to talk about all that here in this spoiler-free review, but before we do so, make sure you're checking me out on all my other social media accounts. If you all are new to the channel, well, welcome to the community. Consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. That way you can get the alert from when I drop new content. If you all enjoyed this review of part 3, 1666, and enjoyed this discussion, well, make sure to like the video as well as share the video. It helps out the channel a lot, but I also appreciate the support. And in the comments, again, I hope you checked out my other 2 previous reviews for part 1 and part 2, but in the comments, let's talk about part 3. What were things that worked? Did you like the bringing the cast of part 1 and 2 back for this last part? What did you think about the story and then how they wrap things up? And what were some of the things that didn't work for you? Let's have that discussion as well. But again, let's talk about in the comments, what was your favorite part in the trilogy, your favorite character, and then would you like to see this strategy of either a film a week if we get another trilogy from another IP, if it's Fear Street or something else, and would you like to see a Stranger Things or a, Witcher have a week-to-week discussion, week-to-week episode versus this binge strategy? Let's talk about it in the comments below. So let's talk about my thoughts, starting off with the positives with this individual film, 1666. First and foremost, I've said it in the previous 2 reviews, and I'm going to say it again. The best part, the shining star, the MVP of this entire trilogy is the director, the captain manning this ship, and that is Leigh Janiak. I am just so impressed for what she was able to do. Again, this was my first time seeing anything of hers, and this will not be the last, because I really do hope, whether it's Neon, A24, Blumhouse, you name any horror franchise or revising a franchise or whatever the case may be, she has the it factor, man. Like what she was able to do, I'm going to talk about this film individually in her direction, but just going to this trilogy as a whole, being able to shoot 3 films, be able to work within the confines of, the pressures of paying homage to Scream and Friday the 13th and adding supernatural elements, paying homage to the novels that these are based upon, and being able to do that is not a feat to not ignore. This is a pretty big accomplishment for her, and what an incredible thing to have on your resume. Again, working with Netflix, having 3 films, completing your own trilogy. I mean, one of my favorite directors is James Wan, and we all know Conjuring 2, he said bye-bye after he didn't come back for part 3. The same thing goes with the Insidious franchise, so it's really hard to find a director to really complete their vision, and I thought that she did a great job. But going back to her direction in 1666, she just has that it factor. She knows how to create tension. She knows how to set up a shot. She has this type of energy and persona and flair and charisma to her screenplays. I really enjoyed what she was able to accomplish in the trilogy, but also bringing it all home with 1666. So again, I am just beyond impressed with her as a director. And again, if you're a horror franchise, and again, I don't want to box her into horror. She might be a great comedy director, action director, sci-fi director, you name it. But if she does want to stay in horror and slashers, give her a franchise. I'm looking at you, Friday the 13th, if you're revising that in the coming years. Or if she wants to create her own franchise, give her the keys to the car, because I really have faith in her as a director. I thought she was incredible in this film, and also her direction to all 3 films were fantastic. But let's talk about the story. Without giving too much away, if you saw I'm assuming if you're watching part 3, you've seen the other previous 2. But what I really appreciate about this story is, and I'm a sucker for this, hence why I love the MCU, it's the connecting of the tissue. It's the connecting of the stories. How this film was able to make me appreciate part 1 even more, appreciate part 2 even more, and even just appreciate what this film was able to accomplish. To have its own narrative going back to the 1600s and telling the story that we got there, but then tying that back to the overall story is really impressive to me. And again, it enhanced the previous chapters in my personal opinion. And I can't go without saying, the production of this film is incredible, from how they adapt the 1600s, how they adapt to the terrible mindsets of how people chose who they love, and the cruel nature of what people did during that time was really heartbreaking, but also just appreciating the costume design, the era that they were in, as well as not ignoring the score of all three films, but also Marco Beltrami, who was one of three composers who worked on all three films, but he was like the main composer. His score is incredible. He really kind of enhances the experience with his score. So I definitely want to shout out the score of this film and the production, but also the tension, the tone, the horror vibes. This to me was the darkest out of the three, and when you see the film, you'll know what I'm talking about. But this film did not hold bars. When it comes to men, women, children, they're killing everyone. And then it has a moment in this film I'm like, oh, this is extremely dark. The subject matter at hand with Sarah's backstory and her relationship with Hannah, and again, seeing what the protagonist, the villain of this film, what they did and how they wanted to accomplish their goal of this kind of dominance over this century of times. It was very dark and very, like I said, I think this is the darkest out of the three, and I have to go back to story. This film did something I've never seen before, and I won't give it away because it's a spoiler-free review, but it was able to switch the story, switch the narrative, and I've never seen a film introduce a new part to the story the way that this film does, and I don't want to obviously give it away. And within that switch in the story, I love this moment. It was so entertaining, and I won't say what it is, but I'll just say a hint here. And when you see the film, you know what I'm talking about. But you all remember Freddy versus Jason and the rumors of a trilogy, or the rumors of a sequel with Freddy versus Jason versus Ash versus potentially Michael Myers. We'll apply that idea, and you get something like that in this trilogy, or in this particular third part, which I won't elaborate on. But when you see the film, you know what I'm talking about. I thought that was so awesome to see. But last but not least, I do have my problems with the third act, which we'll talk about here in a second, but I enjoyed the kind of Home Alone meets the slasher setup that they kind of have within that third act. So those are my really big pros that I have with this third part. Let me transition into my criticisms that I have with this film. The big thing about the story, and particularly 1666, it felt very familiar. And so the Sarah and the Hannah and the story of Dina and the connections of Samantha was very similar to the first part, which was just like, it feels like I'm watching the same movie in a certain sense. And going to that, seeing the same type of movie, I'm not the biggest fan of period piece horror films. I like certain films like The Witch. I'm not the biggest fan of The Witch. I enjoy the creation and the direction and cinematography and all that, and it introduced me to Anya Taylor-Joy, but I don't really like period piece horrors. But even with that being said, I felt like the story within 1666 wasn't as entertaining nor as fun. Now, it's inherently it's not going to be as fun because it is the darkest of the three, but I just didn't have that same energy that I had in the first two parts. And in particular, that first half is more of like kind of slower pace for my taste, especially within this trilogy. And then I got to talk about it. I'm not the biggest fan of the accents. Now, they wanted to go back to the 1600s, 1666 to be exact, and they have like these Irish accents. I applaud the actors for trying to hold it, but they couldn't keep their accents consistent. And I know it's a nitpick, and some people probably don't even acknowledge it, but it really bothers me when you have someone that has such a thick accent at the beginning, then it just slowly fades away within the same narrative. It's just a little nitpick for me, but I had to bring it up. But in particularly with that accent, going to the idea of bringing back characters from part one and part two and having them go back in time and kind of I don't want to give too much away, but there's a reason why the same characters are in that time period. But I personally would have liked to had seen them recast the characters, and not even recast. I would have just probably preferred for them to have the actors that we saw in the flashback play Sarah, play the role versus having Dina play the character. I would have just preferred them to just recast those two main leads that play Sarah and Hannah, just me personally. And then last but not least, as far as my cons, this film has a villain. And it ties into the other parts, but it didn't have that like standout villain. Like we got the Ghostface killer in the first one, introducing the Jason Voorhees character in part one and part two, but it didn't have like that distinct. They all come into the story, obviously, but it didn't have like that distinct villain like those other two previous films had. And again, I'm going to just say, even though I enjoyed the third act in regards to it being entertaining, it did feel a bit bloated, and also it felt rushed to get to the conclusion of the story for me personally. So those are my pros, those are my cons. Before I give you all my overall score and let you know if it's worth checking out, make sure if you haven't already to like the video, share the video, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your pros, your cons, what was your favorite part, your favorite character, and let's talk about it in the comments. So overall, the film 1666, it has its flaws, but I'm not gonna lie, I love the connections to the previous two films, and I thought that the third act had some fun moments, and I really am impressed by this director. So overall, I'm going to give Part 3, 1666, a 3.5 out of 5, which brings me to my rankings. If you've been following my other two reviews of this trilogy, Part 1 is still my favorite, and then Part 3 is my second, and then I have Part 2 as my third favorite. And again, you can watch my reviews, but I gave Part 1 a 4. I gave Part 3, obviously, a 3.5 out of 5, and then Part 2, I gave a solid 3 out of 5. So I want to talk about, before I wrap up, this trilogy and just the accomplishment here. Again, I think the director Lee is a superstar in the makings. I think she did a great job of paying homage to Scream, to Friday the 13th, to slashers, to supernatural elements, obviously paying homage to the books that this comes from. So I really want to stress how of an accomplishment that really is, as well as just that conversation about the rollout. I love that we were able to see Part 1, Part 2, Part 3 over a 3-week period. And if they are to do, because I won't spoil it, but if they do continue this story, I would love for them to do this again, and in particularly Halloween. If you're going to do it again, let's do it in the Halloween season. But also, let's apply that to, I'm not going to lie, and I've always been on the fence about okay, I love binging. I think it depends on the series. I think comedies and certain dramas, it's okay to have a bingeable type of story to be told, especially when you have shows that have cliffhangers and you want to know what happened next. But I think the conversation, and in particularly sticking within the Netflix conversation, can you imagine the theories, the fun discussions, the live streams that I would potentially hold if Stranger Things was a week-to-week show, if The Witcher was a week-to-week show, if The Haunting on Hill House was a week-to-week show? It would be incredible. And I know Netflix, their whole thing is binge, but they've actually, there's a couple shows in the last few years. I think it's more so, and I don't watch these shows, but I'm aware of them. I believe their reality date shows are week-to-week shows, and I'll be honest with you all. I think Netflix, sometimes you gotta adapt, you gotta switch, you gotta pivot. We see what Disney Plus is doing, you see what HBO Max is doing with this week-to-week rollout. Hulu does it as well, and I think it's a perfect time to just pick and choose. If a series, if it calls for a binge, then do it a binge. But if it calls for a greater conversation, and again, just imagine Netflix, if they release Stranger Things week to week, again, Witcher season 2 week to week. Can you imagine the conversations and the way that people will probably stay on Netflix and not cancel a subscription? I don't know, man. I think Netflix should adapt that what they did with this trilogy and apply that to the TV shows and apply that to other movies. Again, not every movie can shoot back to back to back, especially with Netflix having Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Ryan Reynolds, Gal Gadot, Leonardo DiCaprio. They're having all these big movie stars, big time directors that probably don't have the time to do 3 films in a 6-9 month period. But hey, I like this roll out the strategy, and I would like to see Netflix do that again. So that's my thoughts on the film, the trilogy, this rollout. I hope you all enjoyed this review, this discussion. If you stuck around to the end, I really appreciate the support. If you haven't already, make sure to like, share, comment your thoughts below. Also, before I forget, I mentioned my rankings, but I will say my favorite character is Thomas, I should say, and that is the Jason Voorhees character. But again, let me know in the comments your favorite character, your favorite part, what worked for you, what didn't work for you. Let me know your thoughts on the strategy of the week-to-week discussion, and let's talk about it in the comments. I hope you all enjoyed this discussion. Hope you all are staying safe. We'll see you in the next video.